Why keep up?
It's a Smith & Wesson. And you've had your 6.
Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I'm going to be taking time and doing a Tiny D6 video in another one of these Gallant Night games that I've talked about in the past, because today I'm going to be taking time, going to be talking about Tiny Spies, and a little bit about James Bond, because I've been thinking about James Bond being essentially the quintessential spy, if you will, at least in a lot of people's eyes, even though, yeah, James Bond is a very Hollywood character. But I figured I would just take time and maybe discuss your characters, because maybe the next character you want to design is kind of influenced around James Bond. So, who is essentially the most accurate depiction of James Bond is basically what I'm going to primarily focus on. Now, I'm going to base this opinion on the films, and I'm also going to base this opinion on the books, or at least the books that I have taken time to read over the years. Understand, I have not gone through all of the novels, but I've gone through a couple of them. So I think I have a pretty good grasp of the James Bond character himself. And I also thought this would be a fun little video to do because of the recent announcement of 007 First Light. So let's get into it here. And honestly, we're going to have to kick off with George Lazenby. Now, when it comes to depiction of James Bond, I think actually George Lazenby actually had a pretty good grasp of the character. Unfortunately, though, he's only gotten one film under his belt as James Bond, which is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Now, when it comes to the movie itself, it was actually fairly accurate to the book. It was one of the more accurate films, but not the most accurate film to the book. But unfortunately, when it comes down to it, you could tell he didn't have necessarily a full grasp of the character. The story of On Her Majesty's Secret Service was actually kind of one of the weaker James Bond stories, to be honest. And in honestly, my opinion, when you're looking at the films and trying to figure out which James Bond would be the most accurate version of James Bond for your Tiny Spies campaign, well, there's just not enough material there to really gauge him by, which is kind of why he's the blue ribbon loser here, unfortunately. And I know for many people who discuss about George Lazenby being 007, he tends to kind of end up being the blue ribbon loser. But I'm going to be perfectly honest here. If he would have spent more time in the role, I think he actually would have ended up being one of the better Bonds within the films, at least. All right, we're going to move on to the next one, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to say Roger Moore. The problem with Roger Moore is he really didn't depict the character very well at all. I mean, yes, he was suave and all that stuff, but even he admits that he really didn't necessarily care for the character as how the character is portrayed in the books. And he decided to take his own spin on the character because he wanted to essentially separate his tenure as James Bond from Sean Connery, which I'll discuss here obviously in a little bit. The next problem with Roger Moore's tenure too is a lot of the films, while the titles was based on books, a lot of the films were actually based on short stories that they had to make a lot of changes to essentially get a full film out of. So even when it comes to the films themselves, they're not extremely accurate. Basically, it just comes down to, honestly, Roger Moore as 007 for accuracy is a hot mess. Now, in truth, I honestly like his first couple films. but by the end of his tenure, it's kind of like, oh God, could you? They couldn't come up with someone better to do this role at this point. But that maybe that's just me on how the film's just kind of changed in tone and everything else. Okay, the next one I'm going to put out here is Daniel Craig. Now, first off, for looks, Daniel Craig is, well, he's not the most accurate looking Bond. I think when it comes to attitude, he does a fairly good job. So credit where credit's due. When it comes to, like I said, when it comes to the attitude, especially for like an more older James Bond. James Bond was a bit of a more brooding, kind of self-centered character in his later books, and that's kind of what Daniel Craig captures as James Bond. The problem is the stories. Once again, a lot of the stories, a lot of the films are based off titles of various short stories. The problem is they're only really by title only. The stories themselves are heavily modified, and it really, to me, doesn't give us a good, accurate depiction of the James Bond character. And I mean, I guess it could be argued, sure, if it's a more modern setting, but that's kind of the other issue with Daniel Craig's tenure as James Bond is, well, it's not the Cold War period, so there's a lot there that they have to make changes to when it comes to the character himself. No matter which way you look at the end of the day, honestly, in my opinion, one of my favorite films is Skyfall. When it comes to all the, what are we up to now, 26 Bond films? So there's that. So I don't think he's a bad choice to base your character on, but he's not a very accurate one either. The next one is Pierce Brosnan. You know what? He's kind of got the same problems that Daniel Craig has as a character. Me personally, I think Pierce Brosnan actually depicts James Bond better than Daniel Craig does, especially when it comes to look, the attitude, etc. The early films that Pierce Brosnan was a part of, such as GoldenEye, were just great, and they were smash hits in the box office. And when it comes to depicting the characters themselves, the character himself, it was pretty well done. The great thing about Daniel Craig Pierce Brosnan is when he took the role, he jumped into it, and he pretty much had command of the role, like out of the gate. And most of the actors really didn't. It took them maybe a movie or two to really grasp the character. So he did really well there. So I think he's actually a pretty good depiction of James Bond. The problem with his films is, well, especially towards the end of his tenure, they kind of turn into just like this hokey mess. And they're more worried about CGI and high action effects over any kind of accuracy of the character, if you will. All right, if you guys are keeping scorecards here, I'm going to get to my number 2 pick, and that's essentially Timothy Dalton. Believe it or not, even though Timothy Dalton's tenure was only 2 films, it was actually supposed to be more, but there were some court things that prevented him from actually doing a 3rd movie, and maybe he would have even rolled into a couple more films. Timothy Dalton was actually doing the dark, brooding James Bond before Daniel Craig. So, a lot of people, it's funny to see how a lot of people talk about Daniel Craig being like the first dark, brooding James Bond. And it's like, no, Timothy Dalton was doing it way before he was. He was going around kicking ass, taking names, and doing what he needed to do as the super spy. When it comes to the betrayal of the spy himself, Timothy Dalton actually did a rather good job. And honestly, when you look at the accuracy of the character himself and how Timothy Dalton portrayed the character, he actually honestly is one of the more accurate Bonds. Now, when it comes to the films, I'm really not sure about how accurate the films themselves are to the books. Once again, they do have there is books to the titles, but those two books I have not gotten a chance to read yet, unfortunately. But there is some of the other James Bond books that kind of leads to pretty much how Timothy Dalton actually depicted the character on screen. And honestly, it was nice to see the character go kind of back to a more, how would I want to put this, kind of to a more darker tone, especially after seeing the tail end tenure of Roger Moore. So yeah, that's my opinion. Okay, once again, if you guys are keeping track of your scorecards here, of course, it's Sean Connery being the Bond. And in all honesty, when it comes to all the actors who have portrayed James Bond throughout the years, Sean Connery's is the most accurate depiction of James Bond as the character. You actually see him, you see his character grow over the series of movies that he had done. The movies themselves were also a lot closer to the books, with actually Dr. No and Goldfinger being the most two accurate films to the books. So they're not quite one-on-one betrayals, but they are really accurate to one another, which that's kind of one thing too that Sean Connery had probably over any of his predecessors, sorry, not predecessors, any of his successors, is the fact that the films were so close to the books. The source material was still out there. It was still fresh. When it comes to the time framing of the movies themselves, it works perfectly alongside the books. So realistically, he has a lot in his favor as like being the most accurate version of Bond. But, you know, that's just kind of how it falls. And, well, there it is. That's my opinion. Sean Connery is the most accurate Bond. And honestly, in my opinion, he's the best Bond. So anyway, I guess it takes pretty much a Scotsman to portray a British super spy. Anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it, maybe had some fun with this, and maybe it gets you thinking a little bit about your next Tiny Gunslingers, or sorry, not Tiny Gunslingers, Tiny Spies character. Anyway, folks, thanks again for tuning in, and have yourselves a wonderful day.